As we've been going through the past year, and we decided, hey, let's go through this book of Genesis. Let's go through and just see what God did when it all started. And I just want to be honest, the last year and a half has been kind of hard for some of us. In fact, how many of you would just agree with that? It's been a harder, things are kind of different. We're kind of, whatever was before, we're in a new season, and it's kind of a new phase, and it just seems to me like everything has gotten a little bit harder. Now, I don't know if that's true for you, but for me, everything got a little bit harder. Raising kids got a little bit harder for some reason. You know, even the church, which we have the greatest church in the world, y'all the greatest people and all that, but when we decided, hey, let's just get this thing started again, it was a little bit harder to get volunteers, to get this mindset of, hey, let's get up, go to church. It was a little bit harder. And in fact, it astounds me still that, y'all have done a great job of it, but it was just a little bit harder to get things going again. And so we decided, let's go through the book of Genesis and let's just kind of reset. Let's lay the foundation, because really what I want you to see is if we will go into this book and really take the principles of this book, you're going to see that life prepares you for what's coming. And I really believe that in all of the turmoil, all of the struggles we've seen the world have in the last few years, I'm telling you, there are answers in this book. But I want to just kind of start today by reminding us where we've been in this series. If you're new, it's a great day to be here, because I kind of see this as the conclusion of the first epic movie, okay? This is the end of the Lord of the Rings, but we got, the Two Towers or something's coming next, okay? But really what I want you to remember from this is that this is not a book that fell from heaven, a magical book. What this book is, when we talk about the Bible, is this is a book of a whole bunch of different types of literature, but it starts off with what we call narrative or stories. And this is very important to understand why God chose to do this. God basically told these stories, and the way he told these stories is he lived them out. He let these things play out. But you have to remember that this, when we go through Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus, which someday we will do all those too, but when we go through these books were written down way after the stories actually happened in history. And the reason for that is, you need to remember, is that as God was inspiring people to write, he was also inspiring the lessons of the past. And it's also important that we understand the reason they're stories is because we are geared to live out stories. We are geared to remember stories. Sometimes you may hear, there are people who memorize, books of the Bible. Understand, when they memorize the first books, they're memorizing stories. It's much easier. So these are historical stories, but they were written down with a purpose. They were written down for you to take certain things out. And especially Genesis, what I want you to know is everything that happens in Genesis is going to play out through the entire Bible, because this is the problem that most of us face today. We know about the Bible. Most of us know about the Bible. And you'll have people say things about the Bible that may not be true about the Bible. You'll have beliefs that you are living out. And for example, you might be living out, God's mad at me because I did this yesterday. God could never love me because I did this. Or I'm forever going to be behind trying to catch up. All of these little things play out because we know about the Bible, but we don't actually know the Bible. And so what we're trying to do through this is go back and get the big stories of the Bible and show you that if you can read this book, if you will read this book and not just learn about it, but actually read it, it will transform the way you think about God. And so we started off the beginning of the year, we went through Genesis 1 through 11, and it starts off with this one big idea. God created everything. He created everything, and he's writing this to people who believe in a plethora of gods, who believe in a lot of different things. And he says, listen, all of these gods that you think of, the moon god, listen, I created the moon. The sun god, I created the sun. Oh, the Leviathan, the big animals of the ocean, I created them. I created everything. And that's the point that God is trying to make. And then he gives everything to his prized possession. He says, you were made in the image of God. You're his creation. But when he says this, he also gives this dominion. He says, you're going to be able to do the things you want to do. And wouldn't you know it, with that one little freedom, we made the decision. Humanity, makes this decision. You know what? rather than do what God said to do, I'm going to do what I want to do. This one little question, did God really say? And it starts this problem that is going to weave throughout history. Did God really say? We're going to question, did God really say? And so when we get to the life of Abraham, which is a series we're going through, The Wanderer, when we get to the life of Abraham, what we are seeing is God say, you guys have messed this up, but I am going to make you a promise. I am going to redeem this, and I'm going to fulfill things that you can't do on your own, and I'm going to make this right, and I'm going to do it throughout history, through the stories. So when we read the Bible, the reason sometimes the Bible seems simple, sometimes it seems kind of confusing, is because it's written to a way that we can understand, okay? Stories we can understand, and sometimes these stories are messy because when we look at our life, let's be honest, even the most Christian of us in here, if we were to really examine our life, it's messy. It's messy. It doesn't always make sense. So when we jump in today at Genesis chapter 21, it's kind of the end of the first epic of Abraham. And Abraham is kind of the prototype for you and I as followers of God, okay? He's called to this place. If you remember, he was called. That was the first promise he was given. Abraham, I want you to just go. And as he goes in faith, and he doesn't go straight there, he wanders the way that we wander. But eventually he gets there, and he's just wandering in this place where God told him to be. And then God gives him another promise. Hey, someday, not just you, nations are going to be blessed through you, through your offspring. But he's at the time, he's about 75 years old. His wife is about 60-something years old. And so it's beyond time for that. And so they just have to trust that God is going to do what he said he's going to do. And so this chapter is kind of, it reminds me of the end of The Lord of the Rings, one of those movies. I remember watching one of those movies, and at the end of the movie, I'm like, all right, it's good, they got the ring, whatever it was. And then it felt like there was like 45 minutes left of them and this guy had to go this way, and then like reconciling what happens. That's what this chapter is. It's kind of reconciling. Most of y'all are like, I haven't seen Lord of the Rings in 50 years, Joel, whatever you're talking about. So it's reconciling these promises. That's what's happening in this. There are three specific promises, or two that have been given to Abraham, and one is kind of just tacked on so that we can learn a lesson. But the thing I want you to see in this is that God keeps his promise. That's the thread that runs through these three stories we're going to talk about today. God keeps his promises. And this is important for us to realize because life has gotten harder for us, but the promises haven't changed for us. And therefore, when we go through this life, we have to do it with this mindset of, you know what, it got a little harder. It got a little harder, but God keeps his promises. So let's pick it up. Genesis chapter 21, verse 1. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. This is the main idea. He did what he said he was going to do. It says, and Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time in which God had spoken to him. Abraham's 100 years old. Let's remember that. Sarah's 90 years old. Abraham called the name of the son who was born to him, whom Sarah had borne, Isaac. What does Isaac mean? Who remembers? There we go. To laugh. Okay. That's the theme that you'll see. That there's a reason that his name is Isaac, that it is to laugh, or he laughed. Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 years old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born, and Sarah said, God made laughter for me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne a son in his old age. First thing I want you to see is that God keeps promises to his children. And there's an important thing we need to remember about this. It's for 25 years, God has said specifically to Abraham, listen, you are going to have your children. It's going to be through you and through Sarah, and it's going to be your children. And this is an important thing that happens in the history of the Bible, in your theology of understanding who God is and what he is and what he does, is God begins to say, through your children. And if you remember, Abraham had made what we would consider nowadays a horrible mistake, and that he decided, you know what, I can't wait on God. I can't really trust God. God said I'm going to have children, but my wife is way too old to have children. So he goes in and he sleeps with her maid, with her servant, and he has he's got at this point about a 17-year-old child. And so God is making this promise through Isaac. Isaac is now born. It's fulfilled. This promise of faith that Abraham had to make is now there. And so when we look at that phrase, God keeps his promises to his children is a big part. Because for the first time, we kind of have this separation. There's God's creation. He's created everything. And then there's his children, that he's got specific children that he's going to make promises to. And so it should beg the question, well, who are God's children? Aren't we all God's children? Well, when we read the story, we find out we're all God's creation. You are made in the image of God. You have value, all of these things, but all of a sudden, with this story of Abraham, we find out we might be all God's creation, but we are not all God's children. You are not necessarily God's children. And there's this idea sometimes we hear of, hey, we're all God's children, God loves us all, and God does love his creation. But now we see this new thing, this divide between Ishmael, the older son, and it's not anything against Ishmael, the person, but the way that Ishmael came about was Abraham not trusting God. Abraham saying, I will do this the way I'm going to do it. That Abraham saying the same thing Eve said many years before. Eve said, did God really say? Abraham says, I'm supposed to have children. Says it's through Sarah, but did God really say Sarah? And he goes his own way. So the first thing I want you to understand is that God's promises are to his children, and children are not the same as God's creation. I'll think about it this way. So October, I'm going to try to be healthy October. You ever decide you're going to be healthy for a month, and then like the last week of the month before, you're like, so I'm going to be super unhealthy the month before because I got to get real healthy. And so I'm doing a Whole30 this month. I'm going real strong. Yesterday I decided, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make some potato chips, my own potato chips. And they were good, okay? I had about 2 hours to kill on a Saturday. Texas had just won, and so I was like, all right, what am I going to do for the next couple hours? And I start making these potato chips, and they come out pretty well. And here's the thing I want you to know. All the potato chips are mine, right? No. I made them all, but if I gave some of them to you, if I gave some of them to my wife, which I didn't, but if I would have, they would have been my creation, but they aren't mine. The ones that are mine are the ones that I put on my plate that I say, I'm going to eat, and they are mine. So there's a difference between me making something and me declaring, this is mine. And so what happens in Genesis is we begin to lay this thread that God is saying, listen, it's all my creation, but now I'm going to give these promises specifically to my children. And that's why I want to jump over to Galatians chapter 3, and I just want to show you that Paul takes this idea that was started with Abraham, and he begins to play it out more fully. Galatians chapter 3 says this, know that it is those of faith who are sons of Abraham. And from Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles simply means non-Jews. It says, seeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, he preached the gospel before to Abraham, saying, in you shall all the nations be blessed, so that those who are in faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. I'm going to jump over to verse 16. Now the promises were made to Abraham and his offspring. It does not say to his offsprings. He's making a joke, a play on words, referring to many, but to one, and your offspring, who is Christ. And so what Paul does is he takes this idea of Ishmael, the first son, who was done out of a lack of faith, who was created by a lack of faith of Abraham, and then this promise fulfilled in chapter 21 of Isaac, where he says, listen, there are two ways you can look at the promises of God. There is, we can go on our own and we're not in the promise, or we can go and trust God that even if it seems impossible so much that you would laugh at the idea, if you will trust to God, you will receive these promises which will ultimately be fulfilled in Christ. That's what Paul does with this passage. He says, this is about Jesus. And you need to understand, when you trust in Jesus, you are a son of God. Because of your faith in Jesus, you are a son of God. He says nothing about the law. The law has not even been created with Abraham. He says that the gospel was to Abraham, is what Paul says, before any rules were given to you. So as Christ followers, as Christians, we need to remember being a child of God is not about following the rules. It is about trusting God in faith, trusting that he can do what he said he's going to do because God keeps his promise to his children. And so as he's going on, we see that he's tying this in, and we all wrestle with this idea of being God's children, because you also have this other thread that happened, that all of us have these other children, so to speak, okay? Ishmael kind of gets a raw end of the bargain in this, because Ishmael is forever an example of the unbelief in God, whereas Ishmael himself is just a guy who is kind of a victim of circumstance. And so I want to make sure when we talk about Ishmael, God doesn't hate Ishmael. Even when he's used as an example of not what to do, it's not an example of Ishmael being bad. It's an example of Abraham sinned. Abraham shouldn't have done this, and Ishmael bears the consequences. So we're going to switch narratives, okay? So Isaac, the first thing is Isaac is born, but now you've got Ishmael, who is the firstborn son. And understand, even though it's a different mother, the times, in that time, the firstborn was the firstborn. He gets all the inheritance. And this creates a problem. So we keep going. It says, and the child grew, he was weaned. Okay, this is talking about Isaac. They wean children at this time at about 3 years old. So this is about 3 years later. And they would throw a big festival when they weaned a child. And so they throw this big festival. They invite everyone. Abimelech, remember Abimelech from last week? Abimelech is invited to this feast. Okay, there's a lot of people. This is a big deal. It says, but Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. And so she said, cast out this slave woman with her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not be the heir with my son Isaac. She sees Ishmael laughing, okay? And that word laughing the laughing is a theme here that, hey, Ishmael shouldn't be laughing. And so she gets jealous, she gets upset, and she decides we got to get rid of them. And this is a big deal because Ishmael is the rightful heir, okay? And so it says, and the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son. Abraham loved Ishmael. Abraham did not want to send him away. But Abraham also knew, hey, God said this promise that the inheritance is going to go through Isaac. And so he's upset about this. But God said to Abraham, do not be displeased because of the boy, because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to do, do as she tells you. For through Isaac, your offspring shall be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman, and because he is your offspring. And Abraham rose early in the morning, took bread and a skin of water, gave him to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder. That is the water he put on her shoulder. He didn't put Hagar on the shoulder. And he said, along with the child, and he sent her away. And he departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. Now, when the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. And understand, this is a 17-year-old child. This isn't a baby. It sounds like it's a baby. This is a teenager. He was exhausted, though. They're out of water. Then she went away, sat down opposite, a good ways off, about the distance of a bow shot. And we all know how long that is. Hopefully, it's a bow shot of, someone like me and not like a real archer, because that would have been a lot further away, right? So, I don't know why I said that. Because now I don't even know where I'm at. So, about a bow shot. And she said, let me not look on the death of this child. As she sat there opposite, she lifted up her voice and wept. And God heard the voice. Whose voice did he hear? Did he hear Hagar's voice? No. It was the voice of who? The boy. Heard the voice of the boy. This is important. And the angel of God called to her, Hagar, from heaven, and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not. For God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up your boy, hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him a great nation. Then God opened her eyes. She saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave it to the boy to drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up, and he lived in the wilderness, and he became an expert with a bow. And he lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife from the land of Egypt. Ishmael's name is not actually mentioned in this whole chapter. Remember what Ishmael means, anyone? Ishmael means God hears. So it never says his name, but specifically when times get tough, when it gets to the breaking point, it says God heard him. So the main thing that I want us to see, here's the big idea of this one, is that God remembers his prayers for the down and out. God keeps his promise for the down and out. I want you to see this, because some of us here may feel down and out. And I just want to walk for a second in Hagar and Ishmael's feet, shoes, footsteps, whatever. Hagar did nothing wrong. Hagar is grabbed by Abraham and said, listen, you're going to now bear my children. And he forces that upon her, maybe not physically forces her, but she had no options, okay? It's not good. And she has Ishmael. Ishmael's done nothing wrong, but yet always been the source of pain and frustration, because this decision kind of tore the family apart, and Sarah was always making it tough on him. And then it gets to the point where Abraham takes his son and his wife's handmaid, and he just sends them out with a jug of water into the desert. And he says, good luck. And for the rest of his life, Ishmael's going to have to wonder, and we may not even think about it, he's going to have to wonder, what did I do so bad that my father would abandon me? What was so wrong? Have you know people that have mother and father issues, right? You don't just get over that. We read this, and it may be able to say, man, Ishmael had a prophecy over him. Remember that? He's going to be a wild donkey of a man. And it wasn't that he was going to be a bad guy. It's just saying, listen, the prophecy was he was going to be a wild man, do whatever he wants. That doesn't actually come true. It never mentioned that in his actual life. But it was set up. It was going to be a hard time. But I want you to see just as far as it gets. Here's Ishmael. Here's Hagar. She's been basically divorced, okay? And not only that, the divorce was the kind of the better of the two options, because the other one is polygamy. They can have two wives, which isn't condoned by the Bible, or you can divorce, which isn't condoned by the Bible. For some reason, God says, hey, we're going to allow you, and they're not actually married, but she had been there for at least 17 years, 18 really. And God says, it's okay. And so now she's got to live with this idea. Man, I've been forsaken. I didn't do anything to deserve this, but now look what God has done. And now they're dying in the desert. She sees nothing to save her. She takes and she sets her boy down, and she feels like, man, this is it. The one thing I want to remind you, if maybe you feel as if everyone has abandoned you, maybe you feel as if you're all alone and God has forgotten about you, the one thing you can remember, maybe you feel as if, whether you're single, maybe you're divorced, maybe you've gone through some things and you just think God has forgotten me. One thing God adds into this story, this chapter, is he says, we're not just going to leave this story of Ishmael alone. I want you to see, I am for Ishmael. I am for the down and out. Even though he's not a part of this promise, I am for the down and out. And I love the fact that God reconciles this and says, listen, even though it wasn't easy, he had a lot of daddy issues. There's no way he couldn't have. But he still went for the rest of his life. He got a wife. He actually made something of himself, became a good archer. Life just really, really worked out for him as best it could. So here's what I want us to kind of think about this. I know I've been down and out. There are times in my life where I've been down and out. I struggled with depression. Many of y'all know this for years and years. And I was just always felt as if life is just not worth living. And as God would bring me through that, I then planted a church. And this is not the first church. Many of y'all know this. I shut down a church of people. And I will never forget, I shut down this church, and it just weighed on me because it was not going well. People were not connecting the way, the vision wasn't there. There were so many things that I felt like I had failed. And the worst part came when I was at a coffee shop in this time before we had started this church, but we had already shut down the previous church. And I'm sitting at a coffee shop, and some members of my previous church that we shut down came in, and they wouldn't even look at me. I went up and I tried to talk to him, and the man, he was kind of cordial, but his wife wouldn't even look at me. She was so mad, her complexion, her demeanor changed so much, and she left. And I got so I went and sat down, and I just felt like, man, people are further away from God. I'm supposed to help people, and here I am hurting people. It was awful. And I never saw this place. I never saw a church where people actually cared. And I never saw a way through it, to tell you the truth. But that whole time, I just kept remembering, God's made me a promise. God made me a promise. Hey, Joel, you're supposed to start a church. And so we started it again, against what a lot of people told me. You can't start a church in the same place with the same people, except for the ones that left. But we said we're gonna keep doing what God has told us, because God has made us some promise, even when we're down and out. So the first thing I want us to do when we apply this little idea is, some of you are down and out, and I just want to remind you, you may be down, but you are not out. God uses the down and out. God blesses the down and out, and it may take a while to get there, but eventually God will keep his promise even to the down and out. But what strikes me more about this is, for those of us who have been down and out, and now we may be in a place where we're a little healthier. Maybe your family is beginning to figure some things out. Maybe you've got a job. Maybe you're beginning to kind of see through some of these things. You understand that the reason that I love this part of the story is because how many people walked past Ishmael in his course of his life and said, man, you don't want to be around Ishmael. He doesn't have a father. Man, Ishmael is kind of a wild guy. He doesn't have, man, there's just no hope for Ishmael. There's no hope. But the one person who does, Abraham, his father, leaves him and lets him go. But the one person who says, you know what, I'm for the down and out, I'm going to show up for the down and out, is God. So the real challenge when I hear this promise is, I want to remind us that when we are God's children, when we have these promises on us, the first thing we should be doing is looking for the down and out. Looking for people who are going through a time where they don't see God anywhere. And all we need to do is tell them, listen, open your eyes. And so it may be that we have some godly advice. Hey, we're going to walk with you. We're going to show you where water is. The water was right there the whole time. But she was so down. Have you ever been so discouraged you can't even see the water in front of you? All she needed was for someone, and God showed up and said, there's the water. It's right there. When I think about this church, one of the main things we can never forget is this isn't just about us. There are people all around us, especially now, who need someone to say, hey, the water is right here. God is not done with you. The water is right here. I got a text from my mom this past, I think it was yesterday. It was yesterday or Friday. And she said, hey, did you see this post on Facebook? And I said, no, I'm not really on Facebook. And she sent me this post from somebody I've known for years and years, since middle school. And it was just a story of my world crashed, lost everything, no house, even having to get up my pets, no job, no whatever. I'm an embarrassment to everyone. I don't know what I'm going to do. And I just read this, and my heart broke. And it didn't just break because she had lost everything. It broke because she had this remorse of embarrassing her family, embarrassing everyone. Like she was carrying this weight that no one's putting on her, no one's embarrassed for, no one's ashamed of her. But it just broke my heart. And my response was, I actually reached out and I said, listen, I know a place where people care. And I said, this may not be the time for you, but I just want you to know, when the time is right, if you come to our church, I know people who are for the down and out, and we will figure this out with you. You are not alone. If God is for the down and out, we have got to be for the down and out. And we see this throughout the whole Bible. God's heart is for those that are far from God. And the problem is sometimes we forget. That means our heart is for the down and out. Second promise, or the third promise I want to show you in this. And I'm just going to tell you the story because I want to keep us on time. Next thing that happens is these are kind of non sequiturs. They seem to go from story to story, but there's this thread of promise that goes through it. And the last one, it just kind of jumps to Abraham talking to Abimelech, this guy who was the king of the land they're in right now. and they get into a dispute over a well. Abraham digs a well. In fact, I'll show you a picture of the well. There's actually this well. They think this is a well that dates from the time of Abraham. They've made a little nice thing around it, but that's the traditional site for the well. At the very least, it's an ancient well that would have been around. And Abraham gets mad at Abimelech because Abimelech says, hey, I see God's doing great things for you. I see that there's all these opportunities. I don't really want to go against you anymore, Abraham. Let's just make friends. And Abraham says, no, you took a well of mine, and I'm not going to be friends until you give me back the well. And so Abimelech's like, okay, I don't even know what you're talking about. You had the well, whatever. How can you get mad at me? And Abraham said, no, here's what we're going to do. Abraham takes 7 lambs, I don't know why 7, but he does, and he gives them, and he makes a formal treaty. And he names the place Beersheba. Beersheba means place of the oath or place of the 7, okay? And he plants a tree, and in fact, I want to show you another picture. This is in Beersheba. This is the tamarisk tree. This is the exact type of tree. It's probably not the real tree, but this is the exact type of tree. It's actually by a well. But he plants this tree that survives in this area, and he says, I want to mark this place. I want to mark this place because this place is special. For the first time, Abraham has a promise that was fulfilled, the very first promise of go to a place I'll show you, and I'm going to give you a land. For the first time, he has a treaty with Abimelech that actually says, you can dwell here. This is your land. And it's in this promised land of God, and he has this tree now to mark it. And so this last story kind of seems out of nowhere, but understand what we've seen is he had this promise of offspring and of generations going to eventually fulfill in the coming of Christ, and God fulfilled that promise to his children. And even when Abraham screwed it up and went out on his own, tried to do it his own way, and he had this just wake of destruction from having a child outside of his marriage, God said, I'm going to reconcile that too. I'm going to take care of that child too, even though it shouldn't have happened that way. And then God goes back to this very first promise and says, but the whole reason I brought you here, remember, for this land, I'm going to give that to you now. The last thing I want you to see is that God keeps his promise to the faithful. He keeps his promise to the faithful. 25 years before this is when God first said to Abraham, go. Might have been a little before that. So we're talking 3 decades of Abraham saying, what the heck are you doing, God? I thought you were going to give me something, and it's not here. 3 decades. Some of us have waited 3 weeks, and we're like, God, I prayed for this 3 weeks ago. This promise, he's wandered for 3 decades, he's wandered. But he stayed faithful, and he screwed up sometimes, but then he would come back and he'd say, God, just tell me where to go. 3 decades. But Abraham ultimately was faithful. He wasn't perfect. Let's remember this. God never called him to be perfect. He wasn't calling him to be the Savior. He was calling him to be a son. We are children of God when we get these promises. And the way we are children of God is by faith. And all this groundwork is being laid. And even when you screw it up, he will redeem your Ishmaels. But if you'll stick with him, if you'll keep coming back. I'm going to go ahead and invite the band up right now, and I'll close this out. What I want you to see is there's a reason he wanted Abraham to be faithful. There's a reason he wanted this to last 30 years, 25 years, and not 3 days, 4 days. Most of us, when we pray for something, we want it to be in 3-4 days? Yeah, that'd be great. I used to pray about this church. I used to say, God, can I just win the lottery? I'm going to be honest. I've actually bought a lottery ticket. This has been years ago. Just saying, okay, this is our building right here. And God didn't do it, okay? Either God didn't love me, or God recognized something that I didn't recognize. That the worst thing he could have done was give me money to say, listen, you can just have it. And instead, what God has taught me is I need to be the type of person that can receive this promise. What I want you to see about this last story of Abraham's faithfulness is the man who was told the promise is not the man who received the promise. There's an ancient philosopher, Heraclitus. He said, a man never steps in the same river twice. And basically what it means is anytime you step in a river, if you take one more step, the river has changed. But also, the man has changed. As we go through time, we change. You realize in the course of leading this, the reason we shut down a church, I shut down a church, is because I had some leadership problems. I had some ego problems. In fact, I had a lot of ego problems of, hey, I know how to do this. I'm the professional. Let me show you how to do this. And I would point the way, and we may or may not get there. And what I began to see is, you know what, this is less about me. This is what God wants. And every single person that comes, they've added something to this church because I've let go of something in this church. And a lot of us getting here to where now, you realize what God has done in the last year? He's protected us through a pandemic. We've actually in a position where we're about to start our final building fund. We've got $270-something thousand now ready for a building, and we're about to hit it again until we get this thing. But also that, we brought on Ashley part-time for children's ministry. And I'm going to tell you, just give you a little hint, if you come to the next members meeting, we're about to have a student minister too in the coming weeks. And I'm telling you, all this to say, yeah, you can share for that, that's fine. All that to say is I wasn't ready back then for a lot of the things that God is doing this because God had to change me. And when we are faithful, it is not about God not fulfilling Him. It's about God saying, listen, I've got something so great for you. I've got promises so good for you that if you'll endure, if you'll just keep pressing forward and trusting, and I might take you into some deserts, I might take you into some hard times, I might make you broke for a while so that you have to trust me. I might make you have to go and ask somebody for help because you don't like to ask for help. I might make you do some of these things. But if you'll stay faithful, these promises are for you.